Yes, of course I am.
No, but it's not a preference.
Well, Professor Chomsky claims in his statement, which he submitted to Lisson and others in Paris, and that it was unwittingly, without him knowing it, included in the book, that in itself is material, substance. That's a statement which is important, and I think it's very foolish to say, very
What motivated you in the first place to take Chomsky on in such a public way?
It's the only way to do it. Not take him on private.
Except for the margin. Why was it important that the only
Well, in my view, Professor Chomsky uses his considerable reputation as a very famous person in linguistics to further political ideas which I do not agree with. I think that the ideas that he has
intelligence
are erroneous.
by 1977?
So I think that the nations that Washington is the torture and the murder capital of the world, and I think that's an outrageous statement. So one should look at the statements that Chomsky produces and try and reduce them to original error and attack it in public along those lines. No good doing that in private. No, I don't consider that a threat. He is, of course, in his own field very famous. In Holland and certainly in left-wing circles, he is a well-known person. He was one of the gurus of the 60s. My American friends even say that he is also quite relatively walk out in the United States, but I think that is not true in this country. And apart from that, this period, I think that he symbolizes something that I very much disagree with. That's the reason that I have tried to attack him in tonight's program.
And their studies called the press was first carried out by the United States.
Well, because that is not NATO is not the subject of discussion. I am here as a private person. I'm not here as a minister. So any questions that relate to the debate of tonight are welcome. The questions that pertain to my official function, I think, are out of place here. Because I'm not here as a minister and I'm paid to stress that point. It's somewhat unusual for a member of the government to debate with the professor in public. It hasn't happened in Holland before, I don't think it's often happened elsewhere, and that is why the thrust of your request was separated areas.
Never mind, if you're here as a private person, what are you doing with the government spokesperson looking after you?
Well, he goes with me because it has bearing on the rest of my standing in this country. That's the background to the remark.
Thank you very much.
Hello, guys. Sorry, have I...
Criticizing him for exaggerating the fails and stuff like that.
Which would have been Amsterdam, that is, of course, as we all know here, hardly is synonymous with cosmopolitan. And we have Erik Reuland, well known to the visitors of this conference, a linguist and manager, I should say. We have decided to keep the alphabetical order, and as I try to express in my introduction, the idea of this roundtable is to take the monologues and the debate to the level of comment and reflection, hopefully, like in the Greek chorus, reflecting the minds of the audience.
Remark about the press. I suppose all the speakers here want a free press. On the supposition that that's good for many reasons, one of them being that then consent will be more freely given. Now, if you have a free press, like a free market, the press will go this way or that way. The journalist will run after events in good currency. And that may be in one country or in another country. So if you look at that, you will try to see a pattern in it, but whether the pattern reflects the interest of the dominant classes and whether it is indeed an effect of active intervention by those dominant classes remains to be seen. I think if we talk about the United States, we have had many contrary examples that where you see that the press doesn't in any direct, evidently obvious sense serve the ruling classes. I remember myself when the Pentagon Papers were being published, one of the astonishing things was that there was hardly anything in it that one didn't know already from the free press. So I think that what Mr. Chomsky seems to want, he wants a press that is both free and just in the sense that the right amount of attention is given to each event. It's like people want a free market and also a just price in each case. We have markets because, some people favor markets because we assume that in the long run it's better for freedom, but not in each case, and not justice in every case. So what I would ask Mr. Chomsky is what he does with the counterexamples, where the press doesn't serve the dominant interests in the United States, or whether in cases where there seems to be efforts to manufacture consent, but where the ruling classes, as there are many cases, are mistaken about what is their interest, or simply act foolishly. I think he himself will know examples, and so that doesn't fit his pattern. Those are the two remarks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hofland.
Yes. For me, only a few remarks too. I never suspected when I came here that a Secretary of Defense and a professor in linguistics could make me feel so young. This discussion, in its best parts, made me think of the best years of our teach-in tradition. And in fact, not only during the discussions, but only in the end, towards the end of it, I thought this is not going to turn out in a well-defined conclusion. Well, let me try to to formulate something which might go to a conclusion, which might lead to a conclusion. What we have been witnessing is the clash of two theories of conspiracy. The manufacture of consent is not only practiced by the ones which Mr. Chomsky takes as examples, the free press of the United States, being in the background, being led by certain interests of capitalism and certain interests of big business and so forth, and certain interests of the economic industrial complex. But also you have a theory which goes for the exact opposite, which means that the manufacture of consent is in the hands of the left-wing intellectuals who lead the media, who have in the background everything that they pull the ropes in television and in the backgrounds of the editorial offices and so forth. And this manufacture of consent was very much alive during the 60s. This is my first remark. The second is that, of course, Mr. Chomsky is absolutely right that in times of war, in times when big issues are at stake, the manufacture of consent can be very serious, and we have aged in this century. In these 4 years, the manufacture of consent in our small Dutch society was really unbelievable. And the fact that it is not that we still call this extremely ferocious war sometimes, and a war being waged on a big scale, is still being known only as the two police actions, means that Mr. Chomsky in this way is absolutely right. History has not been written. The fact that history has not been written about this war proves that the manufacture of consent is not only valid when it comes down to the working of the press during the times accidents, developments take place, but also in writing recent history. These are the remarks I'd like to make.
Thank you. Dr. Roeland.
Thank you. Well, what I notice is that a lot of people here, they come forward and put forward statements. I'm a bit surprised about that, because when I think about this whole issue, like the manufacturing consent, I have a lot of questions. Basically, if you think about cases like Orwell's problem, recall, it's called the problem. The problem, you can formulate it in several ways, but one of the ways you can formulate it is, how come in certain areas we know so little despite the availability of massive evidence? Plato's problem, again, a problem. How come that in some other areas we know so much despite the scarcity of evidence? So basically what we have is problems. One of the problems I would like to raise, and which I think is an interesting problem, is whether there is any kind of interaction between the two problems, whether they are related or not. So basically one of the things I want to get here is, so to speak, get a discussion about those cases, those problems, those questions off the ground. Now, according to Chomsky, Plato's problem is an interesting problem in the sense that it is something which you can investigate, you can ultimately explain it in terms of innate structure, ability of the mind, etc. He calls it the subject of the study of Plato's problem is interesting and rewarding. Orwell's problem, according to Noam Chomsky, is much less deep. Its basic explanation resides in the way power and privilege control the media to influence the political opinion. Well, on the basis of this statement, I have simply two main questions. First, is there only one factor involved in the way in which, let's say, power and privilege control the media? Is it just in terms of their, let's say, economic buying power, or are other factors involved? A possibility is that, say, basically people, once they are thinking in a certain type of framework, more or less resist changing this. Well, this is a supposition, could be wrong, could be right, etc. That's the question I want to raise. Right? To what extent does this influence, this clinging to, let's say, the existing views? Does this make it possible or make it impossible to manipulate the opinion? To what extent are, let's say, economic factors involved? Are other factors? What's the role of, let's say, common values, shared norms, etc.? Is it just the economic factors, or are those also involved? Is it hard to accept norms which are more or less ingrained in a certain nation, certain culture, etc.? Those are the questions I would like to raise. I have no answers, basically. So what I would like to do is incite you to think about those. What is the role? For instance, you, right? So, for instance, you're referring, I'm glad you brought up the example. You're referring to the war against Indonesia. What is the reason why those events...
But nevertheless well developed and quite rational, and it's sort of somewhat set the standards in this field. Numbers are presented, comparisons are made between equivalent cases and so on. And I must say that in listening to Mr. Bolkestein, I found none of that. I found just examples, which I found rather interesting since he pointed out that you can't just have examples. I must say if Mr. Bolkestein had been my student in a methodology class, I think F would have been the grade. Now, on the other hand, there's also the question of theory besides data. What kind of theories they have. Chomsky and Herman in their book present a certain model of how consent is manipulated and so on. Mr. Bolkestein, it turns out, is not theoryless. He also has a theory, or at least maybe he has more of a theory, but the one part of the theory that he actually mentioned was this. People, because of their Christian background, have guilt, and therefore they want to believe in certain things. In other words, Christian guilt is the basis for many kinds of beliefs and actions. Of course, he presented no evidence for this, and it's a rather strange view. And in fact, the Christian guilt was supposed to cause the actions of three people who questioned American actions of various kinds. By the way, was it an accident that the three people he mentioned, Shirley MacLaine, Susan Sontag, and Mary McCarthy, were all women? I was surprised he didn't add Jane Fonda to the list. Let me just bring back, just try to make, there's no time, but try to make a few comments relating this particular issue about the manufacture of consent to the issues that Chomsky raised in his talk this morning, and then Harry Bracken also in some comments. I think there seems to me there should be some deep question. Eric mentioned something like this too, Orwell's problem. Why is it that the manufacture of consent works? I mean, we know about power and so on, but as Chomsky points out, often people, even when they're exposed to information, even when the information is somehow available and they can get it, don't seek it out. He's pointed this out in some writings, that sometimes information in America is actually available, people don't take it and don't inform themselves. Sort of the question is why? Why does it work? Especially if we accept Chomsky's assumption, which I also agree with, that probably there is a moral sense that people have, and that one should study this akin to the way one studies, say, generative grammar. The question is, why does it work? I mean, the best guess one would have, I think, aside from the standard considerations of power, etc., which Chomsky in many cases documents, but often it isn't power. So things are going on. Well, there's probably something else going on, probably many things, some of them having to do with other kinds of human needs, the needs for affiliation. I mean, the question is, why do people conform? Okay, and presumably there's some kind of need for conformity in these simple situations. After all, it is a useful task in fairly trivial cases. Choosing what restaurant to go to is often worth not fighting about, for example. One would, in fact, like to see a study of these things. I think a study I wholeheartedly endorse.
Remember, I started by saying there was no thesis proposed. The thesis was proposed, namely that the media that the elites always manipulate. Now, of course, there's nothing in the world that works like that. When you discuss things in the world, you discuss major tendencies. You'll always find what I described as statistical error. So, in fact, the questions that arise, as I see it, are two. There's a value question and there's a factual question. The value question is, should elites manufacture consent through the media and other means? And recall, it's interesting we didn't discuss this, because the very phrase manufacture of consent is derived from the statement that they should. And as I said, there is a very long tradition going back to the beginnings of modern democracy, saying it is precisely the task of the educated classes to manipulate and deceive the public to keep them from interfering. Now, the fact that we didn't discuss this, I leave it to you to judge. But the phrase itself is drawn from a value judgment, which I illustrated and I can get much more of. And I think we tend to evade it because, in fact, there's a real commitment to it. In fact, it's the dominant theme in the discussion of democratic theory, as can easily be demonstrated. Now, the second question is, do the media function in this fashion? Well, that's a factual matter. You can't talk about random examples. As I mentioned, if you want to think about it, there are thousands of pages, literally, of closely documented analysis which subject the thesis to the hardest test that anybody can think of. For example, we've let the opposition pick the ground. That's the hardest test you can imagine. Let the people who think the press is independent pick their examples, and then we'll study those and show that they illustrate our thesis. Two cases were brought up. One, the Tet Offensive, which coverage of Tet Offensive dramatically illustrates our thesis. The only way you can claim the opposite is to note what you have to believe the opposite. You have to believe that although the press accepted totally the US government propaganda structure. So when we bomb villages in South Vietnam and kill South Vietnamese, we're defending them. And although the media were more optimistic than US intelligence, still they were not optimistic enough. That's what you have to believe. Well, I don't, or take Watergate, again, dramatically illustrates our thesis. That's why we discussed it. The question was what I do about counterexamples in cases where the ruling class